webinar aimed to introduce the two civil society organizations, the three United Nations Drug Convention, and the role of UNODC, the Commission on Narcotic Drugs, and INCB, the International Narcotic Control Board, in their interpretation. It is really an honor for me to start speaking. It is a joint webinar organized with the Vienna NGO committee, so you will hear some welcoming remarks from me and then from Jamie Bridge, the chair of the Vienna NGO committee. My name is Mirella Doumafrahi. I have the honor to lead the Civil Society Unit in UNODC. It is a small unit under the direct supervision of the director of the Division of Policy Analysis and Public Affairs in UNODC, the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime. So as I said, this event is jointly organized with the Vienna NGO Committee, which is the umbrella organization of NGOs who work on issues related to drug. I would like to thank the United States, the government of the United States, who has supported and basically helped us financially to have this series of webinars. This is the first one, and we will have two more before the CND, hopefully, one on prevention and treatment and the other one on the CND itself. This is why to choose maybe a few words on what's our role as civil society unit. I think I've introduced myself, and I would like to say we are really like the door of entry for civil society engagement within UNODC. We facilitate their participation in the intergovernmental meeting, including the Commission on Narcotic Drugs, and we provide also training and workshop to build the capacity of civil society in view of being able to support also member states in the implementation of their international commitment. Why this theme? The international drug control, the three international drug conventions are really the cornerstone of international drug system, as very often repeated by member states. They have almost a universal adherence, and while they are in place since decades, their interpretation and implementation has evolved over the time. They are more. You will hear more about my colleague, but they do reflect scientific evidence and realities on the ground, and also there has been during this year a lot of work also with the NGOs and civil society to highlight when, for instance, there has been misinterpretation of this convention, because of course it happens, and I will always remember some 10 years ago already, the International Cancer Union, an international NGO, with a campaign saying, please do not make us suffer anymore, that highlighted the lack of access to medicine. And my colleague later will say why. I mean, it is important also to have access to drugs as medicine. I will just want to maybe walk you through the agenda now. We are going to have, after the opening remark from Celso, some quick energizer by warm-up by Billy, who is my colleague. You probably all know Billy Batwer, who also works in the civil society team. He will introduce then our two colleagues from the substantive unit, Celso and Stefano, who will speak respectively on the International Drug Convention and the role of INCB, the role of UNODC, the CND, obviously. And then there will be a question-answer session. And then we will move to the presentation of Alicia, our colleague from the Secretariat of the governing body, who will present the e-learning tool on the conventions. Jamie, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mirella. So just, I can see there's lots in the chat. So just to reconfirm, and if the translators could stop translating this part so that there's no overlap. But just to confirm, when you select your language, please also select to mute original audio. And then you should only hear the language that you want to hear rather than hearing multiple languages at the same time. So hopefully that works for people. So, okay, so I'll start with my intervention so the translation can start again. Thank you. So thank you, Mirella, and thank you to the UNODC Civil Society Unit for helping to organize today's event, and also to the US government for supporting this work, and to all of you for attending today. And thanks for bearing with us while we fix the translation issue. My name is Jamie Bridge. I'm the chair of the Vienna NGO Committee on Drugs, or the VNGOC. For those who may not know us, the VNGOC is a global committee of nearly 300 civil society organizations, and we work to support engagement with UN agencies and the meetings that are related to drugs. We help to open up civil society space, to coordinate speaking opportunities, and to ensure strong participation at the UN Commission on Narcotic Drugs in Vienna. We also host the NGO Marketplace, which is a platform for hundreds of NGOs around the world to showcase their work and share their ideas and connections. So you can find out more about us at vngoc.org or on our social media platforms. So today's event is a great opportunity for us to learn more about the International Drug Control Conventions, but also an opportunity to ask important questions directly to some of the entities that are most engaged in their implementation. We're going to do everything we can to ensure that there's lots of time for questions, and I encourage you to please submit your questions on the chat or in the Q&A box that you will see on the menu on Zoom. As someone who started working in the drug sector around 2000 and started work in policy in around 2006, the drug conventions are something that's just always been there. And I have to confess that it was several years into my career before I actually sat down to read what the conventions really do and don't say, rather than what I assumed they said or how they've been widely interpreted. They are old documents. 2 of them predate me, and I certainly feel old, but it's important to reflect on them regularly and to remind ourselves of the commitments and the directions that were set in 1961, 1971, and 1988, as well as the intentions behind them. As 2021 is the 60th and the 50th anniversary for 2 of these conventions, now is a perfect time to have this discussion. So I hope you enjoy the event today, and I really look forward to hearing your questions and your feedback. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jamie. I think, Billy, are you ready?
I'll start sharing the screen now.
I guess I'm happy that most of you provided an answer to this initial question, the same way that we believe those that negotiated the drug control conventions also had it in mind, and at least that's how these treaties have been interpreted in the last years, more and more with this focus on ensuring that every measure taken within this drug control system is intended to protect the health of people from harmful effects of drug use, and from drug use disorders that might ensue. It's important also to notice, before we get to talk about the drug control conventions in this very quick overview, to remind ourselves that all measures of control provided under these conventions, but also recommendations or commitments that countries have taken since the coming into force of these treaties. They include, for instance, licensing, import and export limitations, monitoring of precursor substances. There are requirements to criminalize. All of them, all these measures, which might be intended to reduce the illicit supply of drugs. And when we say illicit, it means for non-medical and non-scientific purposes, according to the conventions, or measures that are intended to reduce the illicit demand of those drugs. All of them, they don't exist as an end in themselves. They serve this common goal which is to protect public health. All of these control measures are aimed at the same time at ensuring that there is a licit supply and demand, meaning supply of those drugs for medical purposes, but also for scientific purposes. And countries should ensure the availability of those substances and access to them for those purposes. And these control measures, they also intend to prevent the diversion. All that is a means to achieve the goal of improving public health. With time, countries have, in making their policies, have also come to realize that several of those measures might have health and social consequences. These are the terms that are used. And there are also policies that are not particularly aimed at reducing illicit demand or reducing the illicit supply, but might be simply intended to reduce those health and social consequences. One example of that might be the distribution of clean syringes in order to prevent HIV and other bloodborne diseases to reach the persons who use drugs. At the same time, it's also good to observe that those conventions we'll be talking about, they don't exist in the member states. And especially we should focus on, we should highlight the fact that human rights of drug users, but also of accused persons of drug offenses, for instance, all that continues to exist. There is a lot of conversation in the last decades about the drug control system being used as an excuse to infringe on those rights. I think it's important for us to say that no such a thing or no such a contradiction is found on the treaties themselves. When it comes to those conventions, so there are three of them: the 1961 Single Convention, the 1971 Convention on Psychotropic Substances, we'll mention them soon, and the 88 UN Convention Against Illicit Trafficking Narcotic Drugs and Psychotropic Substances. They enjoy near universal adherence. I think we can go to the next slide, please. Many ask themselves which substances are under control. So how do they come to being under control? Drugs controlled under the 61 and the 71 conventions, they are categorized depending on their therapeutic usefulness and the public health risk that they pose. When we look, and the most simple convention to look at is the 1971 convention. When we look at that, it uses the four schedules of that convention, use kind of a sliding scale of two variables, of these two variables. So Schedule 1 implies high public health risk and low therapeutic utility, and therefore the strictest control measures apply. Whereas Schedule 4 implies the lowest public health risk among those substances under control and higher therapeutic utility. When we look into the 61 convention, we have that more or less risk to public health for the first two schedules. We have that clear distinction. Then we have a third schedule, which are preparations, certain preparations of substances in Schedule 1 and Schedule 2, which then are exempt from some control measures. And Schedule 4 consists of selected drugs that are in Schedule 1 that are considered to have particularly harmful properties and may be subject to special measures of control, or even have their production, manufacture, export, or any import, possession, or use prohibited, except for amounts that may be necessary for medical and scientific research. When we look at the 88 Convention, the scheduling of precursors has another process. The two schedules there, they reflect basically the needed control when because those substances are used in the illicit manufacture of narcotic drugs and psychotropic substances, and they reflect the need that countries have to use those substances in industry. It's important to see that the selection of those controlled substances is based on scientific assessments and recommendations by the WHO for the narcotic drugs and psychotropic substances. And when it comes to precursors, under the 88 Conventions, it's the International Narcotics Control Board that does that assessment. So we'll hear from Stefano later on how that works. But the final decisions on the controlled substances are made by the Commission on Narcotic Drugs. When those conventions came into being, there was a drafting committee and there was also a technical committee composed of experts by the negotiating parties, which at that time decided on the first substances that came under the schedules. And we had a representative from the World Health Organizations as an observer and participating in the discussions and making recommendations. Ultimately, it was the decision of the negotiators of those treaties. Next slide, please. When we look into the 61 and the 71 conventions, it's important to see they follow a similar structure to an extent. The 1961 conventions is named the single convention on narcotic drugs because it was meant to consolidate all the drug control treaties that had existed before the United Nations existed during the League of Nations. And most substances in the 61 convention are plant-based, either natural, such as morphine, for example, or coca, and cannabis, or they are semi-synthetic, for example, methadone, which is derived from opium poppy. So that's a convention, the 61 conventions has some control measures on the cultivation of those plants. And it requires certain measures and the establishment of national agencies by states parties. When at the end of the 1960s, countries were confronted with misuse of some synthetic drugs which were not controlled under the earlier treaty, there was a discussion whether to do a protocol to the 61 Convention or a new treaty. And because of certain disparities of control and interests of producing countries of those substances, there was a decision of having a separate treaty. So when we look into the 71 Convention, we'll have the control of amphetamine type substances, for instance, but also hallucinogens, sedative hypnotics such as barbiturates and benzodiazepines. So except for the drugs in Schedule 1 of the 71 Convention, all the other ones have very known use, pharmaceutical use and medical use. When it came to the 71 Convention, there was the introduction of certain concepts that were not there at the original convention, the 61 Convention, related to the treatment of persons who use drugs, referred to at the time as drug abusers. But there was already the idea that certain measures such as education, such as treatment, could be provided in addition or as a complete alternative to more traditional criminal law measures. This was also incorporated into the 6th UN Convention through a protocol adopted in 1972. Importantly, also the 6th UN Convention established the INCB as a control body to ensure the balance between supply and demand for licit purposes, and it merged bodies that existed under the earlier conventions. But my colleague Stefano will speak about it in a minute. Next slide, please. Sarah? Yeah, thank you. So those two conventions we talked about were pretty much aimed at detailed administrative measures that countries should have. There was only one provision addressing offenses. Especially in the 80s, there was a growing problem in many countries with mafia type of organizations. And there was the call for a new convention to address the criminal aspects of drug trafficking. So these mafia type organizations, the main business was drug trafficking. And to address international cooperation in criminal matters. This is what the 1988 convention is about. It's focused on illicit trafficking. When it comes to harmonization of the scope of drug offenses, so it becomes much clearer than the earlier conventions. There is an unambiguous obligation for countries to establish, for states parties to the treaty, to establish drug trafficking and related activities as criminal offenses. It is the first treaty at international level that addresses measures against the laundering of proceeds of drug trafficking. So money laundering only existed before that in a handful countries at national level, but not at international level. There was also a definition, there was an agreement after lengthy discussions to also have an obligation to criminalize possession, illicit possession, illicit purchase, and illicit cultivation of narcotic drugs or psychotropic substances, but that is subject to the constitutional principles and basic concepts of each party legal system. So we see quite a variety of opinions by states parties in this regard. When it comes to improving and strengthening international cooperation, this was also the first treaty that addressed at a multilateral level measures for the extradition and mutual legal assistance in relation to drug trafficking related offenses. This was taken over later on by the United Nations Convention against Transnational Organized Crime and later on against corruption as a development of what had started during that period. We also had, as means to effectively combat illicit drug trafficking, the setting up of controlled deliveries, so which later on led to other so-called special investigative techniques to tackle drug traffickers. And there was also the creation of a comprehensive legal and regulatory regime for precursors and control of materials and equipment that may be used in the manufacture of those narcotic drugs and psychotropic substances. In this case, there is, for instance, the obligation of having pre-export notifications from one country to the other. I think Stefano will probably address that in some more detail. Something we had mentioned before that had appeared in 1972, in 1971 and 1972 was also further clarified in the 88 Convention to the effect that alternatives to conviction or punishment are possible in terms of measures of education, measures that foster reintegration or social reintegration, or the treatment for drug use disorders. As complete alternatives to conviction, that would mean in a step before the sentence is adjudicated. And when it comes to punishment, it might be to substitute another type of penalty that could be provided. Next slide, please. So this is in a very few slides an overview of what these treaties provide for. But I believe it's also important for you to understand that the International Drug Control Conventions also provide to certain institutions certain roles. I think we still don't see the next slide. And I will speak about 3 of those institutions, knowing that Stefano will speak about the International Narcotics Control Board. Whenever the 61, the 71, and the 88 convention speak about the Commission on Narcotic Drugs, they speak mostly about the scheduling decisions at first, so this which we have already spoken about. But the Commission on Narcotic Drugs, being a subsidiary body of another United Nations organ, which is the Economic and Social Council, also has broader drug policy competence or functions. They can make recommendations to states parties on the implementation of the aims of the conventions. They monitor global trends. They propose new policies, and mostly these recommendations, these observations on global trends, they're discussed yearly by this commission that meets in Vienna normally. And these recommendations come in the format of resolutions. Another body that has an important role in the drug conventions is the World Health Organization. They basically make those recommendations on the basis of scientific assessment for the addition, deletion, or transfer of schedules, of substance among schedules, which countries can also initiate. So the starting of a scheduling review might be done by WHO itself or by parties, and then the process goes to WHO for assessment before it comes back for decision by the Commission on Narcotic Drugs. And the WHO provides that assessment, which is normally not, which should not be disputed by the Commission on Narcotic Drugs on its medical and scientific basis. Obviously, the Commission on Narcotic Drugs has also the ability of taking their decisions on the basis and the analysis of other factors, including social factors, economic factors, and etc. Perhaps in the questions and answers, we'll come back to that. And finally, when the conventions speak about a role for the Secretary General of the United Nations, that role is normally taken on behalf of the Secretary General by the UNODC, the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime. We provide the Secretariat services to the CND, but also, as Stefano will explain, to the NCB that have their own organization within UNODC. And UNODC also has an important role in supporting governments in their efforts to carry out their obligations under the conventions. Normally, this role comes from recommendations and resolutions and mandates from the Commission on Narcotic Drugs or higher bodies such as ECOSOC or the General Assembly. And UNODC may provide, upon request by states parties, assistance in the review of legislation, capacity building to medical or health personnel, as well as to law enforcement and prosecutors, with the aim of reducing illicit supply and demand. So we are constrained by these purposes and these objectives of the conventions, including in the areas of prevention and treatment. I will thank you for your attention for now, and I will be available during the questions and answers, and I give the floor back to Billy. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Celso. Hopefully you can hear me now without interruption. So thank you so much for that overview, Celso, of the International Drug Conventions. And with this, we would like to also, once again, to follow up with another question. This time we will do just perhaps just this one question. And again, you go back to that particular platform which you've been to already before. You use the same link, and there you will find the question that we would like you to answer based on a presentation from Celso right now. So which entity is responsible for deciding on the substances under control? So you've already heard Celso's presentation. Now that should be an easy one, I believe. So which entity is responsible for deciding on the substance under control? And I see a lot of C&D comments coming through. So you can keep them, just keep bringing them in. I think we can have more of this for sure. So there are more coming through, I see. And so, yeah, so basically I think, yeah, this is an easy one yeah, exactly, as you have already listened to the presentation from Celso. So yeah, with that, we can go then to the next very quick one. Perhaps we do this one. This one maybe is a little bit more also interesting for you because, of course, most of you here are civil society organization. And basically for this, we would like you to just take a minute to write the answers to this in a chat. So use only the chat box, not the platform that you just use now, but the chat box. And basically just let us know, based on what you just heard from Celso, which areas of intervention do you think may be positively influenced by more involvement of civil society organizations? So the work that you do, the communities you work with, which areas of intervention do you think may be positively influenced by more involvement of civil society organizations? So please put all those questions into, put all those answers into the chat, and we will record all those answers. It will be interesting to see what ideas that come from the audience, and then we will make sure that we capture those, and we'll be looking forward to reading them. With that, it would then be my pleasure to give the floor to our colleague, Stefano Berterame, who is in fact the Secretary AI of the INCB, and also officer in charge of the INCB Secretariat here in Vienna. Stefano is going to give us a presentation on the role of INCB in international drug control, in international drug conventions. So Stefano, you have the floor, please.
Thank you, Billy. I hope you can hear me and in the right channel. So perfectly. Yeah, okay. Thank you very much, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I see that there are almost 200 people connected, so that's very good. I would like to, first of all, on my screen, I only see the blank screen of Zacharias at Yahoo. I don't know why I don't see the slides. But maybe while Billy maybe is fixing this, I wanted to say that I thank the NGO committee for organizing this, because the board has been trying in the last years to get more involved with the NGOs. There was obviously a dialogue during the CND that was taking place, and also we always met also when there were missions of the board to some specific countries. We always made sure that we were able to meet with some of the NGOs in that country that were concerned about the issue related to drug control, treatment and rehabilitation, and availability of a drug for medical purposes. Also, we work also with some NGOs that are involved in this last topic, which are the issue of availability. When we prepare reports about this, we also send a questionnaire to the NGOs, and their input was very welcome. Also, the board produced an annual report where there are thematic chapters. I think for the last thematic chapter, we had the chance to also consult the NGOs. There was a thematic chapter on cannabis use. There was another chapter on young people and drugs, and also last year there was a chapter on drug use among old person. And even though we were not able to meet because of the COVID situation with the NGOs, we asked for written contribution that eventually were used also for the preparation of this thematic chapter. Actually, the annual report with the thematic chapter is coming out on 25th of March, and so you'll be able to read it there. So, but let's go and start into the INCB. So you can see on the screen that INCB is basically reporting to ECOSOC. There are 13 members that are elected by members of the ECOSOC. They are elected in their personal capacity. They are not representing their country. They are considered to be in experts in various fields that are related to drug control. And so 10 members are submitted to the ECOSOC by member states, and there are 3 members that are submitted by the WHO. But in order to be elected, they need to be elected by the members of the ECOSOC, which there are 54 members of the ECOSOC. There is 1 member more than the CND because the CND is a subsidiary body. So I am the secretary ad interim of the INCB Secretariat, which is administered by UNODC, but we respond on substantive matters to the members of the board. Next slide, please. So the board was established in the 1961 convention, as Celso has mentioned, and also replaced the previous bodies that existed under the League of Nations for the control of controlled substances, especially at the beginning of the last century was about opium. Then there were more mandates that were given to the INCB that are outlined in the Convention on Psychotropic Substances, and also in the 88 Convention, as Celso mentioned, there was an effort to put under international control precursors chemicals that were used in illicit drug manufacture. And the board was given responsibility, clear responsibility in that area, including to submit to the attention of the CND the precursor chemical that could be considered for control. While, as you heard, in relation to psychotropic substances and narcotic drugs, this role is performed by the WHO. So next slide, please. So this is a picture of the board. There are 13 members. As I said, they are elected by ECOSOC, and each member is elected for a period of 5 years and may be re-elected. As I mentioned, they sit in their personal capacity, and the secretariat that serves them is based here in Vienna. This picture is not completely up to date because there are members that have joined recently, but unfortunately, because of the COVID-19, they were not able to travel to Vienna, so we don't have an updated picture. But you'll find their profile and in our website if you are interested. Thank you. Next. So I think Celso touched upon this. So one of the scope of the convention is to ensure that controlled substances are used for medical and scientific purposes, and these there is no diversion. So the board has a special responsibility in this in terms of monitoring the illicit trades also in chemicals and preventing the diversion. The board is supposed to assist states in this process to make sure that there is cultivation of narcotic drugs that are illicit. Sorry, I
give them a little bit. You know how civil.
I hear a noise. Someone has opened the mic. So also to assist state in preventing the illicit cultivation, evaluating, also recommending, as I said, chemicals that can put under international control, and also overall to identify weaknesses in the implementation of the treaty, suggest remedial actions. So just a very quick next slide. So this is the structure of the INCB. There is a section, the secretary, which is the position where I'm sitting temporarily at the moment. Then there is a section that is looking at the overall implementation of the convention. And then there are 3 sections that are reflecting the 3 conventions that were described by Celso. Next. So, as I said, the Secretariat basically makes sure that the international control system is administered. We receive data, we analyze the data, and then we take action to encourage country to report appropriately the data that are that reflects the production, cultivation, and trade of substances. If there is a discrepancies or an imbalance in the international trade, this is investigated to make sure that there has been no diversion. Also, we look at the data on supply and demand of opiates. This is to try to maintain a balance and to avoid accumulation of excessive quantity of the substance, to avoid also the risk of diversion. As I said, we have also mission to specific countries in case there is the need to look at the way in which they are complying with the provision of the convention and provide advice to governments on a bilateral basis also during the year. More recently, we have been engaging in training. We have an initiative that is called INCB Learning, for which we provide training to the regulatory authorities in the countries on how to implement the provision of the convention. Next. Well, the control system that I mentioned before is through 3 pillars. There are estimates for the 61 Convention, assessment for the 71 Convention, and annual legitimate requirements for the 88 Convention. So this is the forecast that each country needs to provide a few months before the beginning of the year to the NCB to make sure that we know in advance what are the needs of each country. Then during the year, they need to provide trade data, and also a few months after the end of the year, they need to provide consolidated final data for the year to the Secretariat. So these data are analyzed, and we try to make sure that there is no gaps or no missing information on this matter. So next slide, please. So as I said, the analysis that the INCB makes is to make sure that there is no diversion, and also to make sure that there are, the eventual weaknesses in the control system at national and international level are identified. But also we look at the trends in terms of licit use of controlled substances, particularly narcotics, drugs, and psychotropic substances. And this has been very useful in order to provide member states with information for their own policy. The next slide is an illustration of our reporting. So here, for example, you could see that regarding fentanyl, as you know, has been one of the substances that has caused a lot of the opioid overdose death, especially in North America. So we received the information from the countries, and you can see that over the years, there was an increase until at least 2010 in the manufacture of fentanyl. And then because of the measure that were taken to put it under control, there was a slight decrease. So this is one of the problems that we have highlighted. And also, for example, there was the pie chart indicating also who is consuming fentanyl mostly, and as you can see, the mostly industrialized countries are using fentanyl. The next slide also shows equally the increase in fentanyl over a number of years, and also you can see that morphine, which is the gray line at the bottom, which is indeed a pain medication that is effective and also more affordable. The consumption of morphine has been relatively stable. So this is something that we point out because we know that in many countries there is no access to pain medication, but maybe the pharmaceutical industry is more interested in promoting fentanyl, which is a very strong, effective in certain situations like in an hospital, but certainly cannot be used extensively in systems that do not have developed health infrastructure. The alternative would be to use morphine, but as you see, the consumption of morphine is relatively flat. Next. So the NCB, as I mentioned before, we analyze the data and provide information to member states. The main tools that we use for this is a recommendation that are presented to the governments, the United Nations during the CND and other bodies, but also the main output of our work during the year are reports that are illustrated in the next slide. Please, next. So there is the report, the overall report of the board that is presented to the CND every year at the session of the CND. Also, the precursors report based on Article 12 of the 88 Convention is presented at the CND. And then there are the two reports on narcotic drugs and psychotropic substances, the green and the yellow one that are at the bottom, that provide detailed data on the illicit use and trade of these substances. And also, as I mentioned, there are special reports like the one on the top left side of the slide. This one was on availability. And this year we will present a special report on the 60th and 50th anniversary of the two conventions, the 61 and the 71 convention. Next. So some of the things that over the years that the board has been able to identify is, for example, by looking also at the implementation of the policy at national level, the fact that there is need for gender sensitive drug policies, for example, in relation to access to treatment and recognition of the drug use, and also in terms of criminal justice policies and drug-related criminal justice action that in some countries are, targeting or affecting women more than men. Also, the issue of extrajudicial targeting of drug offenders, the board has been very clear on this, in particular in relation to the Philippines. Also, death penalty is something that, in terms of proportional measures, is not should not be, in the opinion of the board, should not be applied for drug offenses. We know there are countries that are still, considering it, and the board has been very clear about the fact that asking countries not to apply death penalty for drug-related crimes that are not of serious level. If you can go back 1 second, I wanted, so as you know, of course, the issue of the legalization of non-medical use of cannabis has been one of the issues that has been dominating the debate where the board has been participating, an alternative to imprisonment. So as I said, also the board continues with dialogue with governments and also the report that I illustrated before. So this is, I hope I was within the time. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stefano. We have now some, I would say, less than 10 minutes for question answer on the two presentations that were made. I know there are many questions that came. So what I would like to suggest is that maybe Celso take 1 or 2 live. I know that he is answering in the chat, but it would be good. So if you find some question that would benefit the rest of the audience, please, Celso, do answer live. And then we will move also to Stefano. I see some question that probably has been already a bit covered by his presentation, the gender aspect, but maybe you can add something, Stefano. And then, yes, we will have then at least, we want to keep some 20 minutes for the presentation of Alicia.
So may I? So Mirella, I saw that some of the questions, they may be better understood if you will look outside the conventions, but also at the political commitments that bodies took on the basis of those conventions. So one question is about why it is only a possibility and not a recommendation to treat substance use rather than punish. Treaties are binding on states parties, and parties are very reluctant on assuming new obligations. So there is not a lot of detail that comes into the issue of treatment, which is then performed at national level. And countries are very reluctant at signing up to treaties that will tell them how to perform that at national level. Now, it is a recommendation to treat substance use rather than to punish. I think by now we have come to a very clear answer at scientific but also political level in this regard. I will put in the chat a link to a publication that UNODC elaborated together with the WHO a couple of years ago, 2016, 2017, which is exactly on those alternatives to conviction or punishment, how this happens in certain countries and how this could be looked at. This publication could also answer another question which was made on whether drug abusers should be punished or referred to treatment. I think definitely the idea of treatment is to address the underlying causes of drug use disorders, and therefore a simple punishment will not be a socially proportionate and even responsible answer to the use of drugs or to whatever other offense was committed because of the use of drugs in this case. The same way, there is another question on the how can the treaty system do to ensure that human rights provisions within the treaties is fulfilled in line with other relevant UN documents. So the treaties themselves, they do not address those types of situations. In case of conflict, parties would need to take a decision and prioritize their international obligations. In most cases, if not all of them, this is possible while still observing the mandatory provisions of the treaties. There was also another question, if I get it well, about the INCB members, I know, but I think Stefano can reply to that. Someone asked for a drug abuser client who refused treatment, what should the counselor do? Normally, that's the thing. The relationship between health personnel and and patient is one thing on which judges and policymakers should not try to interfere. So consentment is quite considered by health personnel as necessary for treatment. What can happen is when the judicial mandated treatment takes place, there is an obligation to appear before health personnel. So this is how it happens in certain jurisdictions, and we consider it as being a good practice. That then if the health personnel doesn't get the consent from the person, it ends up being just an obligation to appear before him, open up of an opportunity of undergoing treatment, but not necessarily an obligation to do the whole treatment. It might be different in other jurisdictions. I think this is more a matter of implementation, and this is something that countries have been discussing also when it comes to the implementation of these commitments they have made. For instance, if you look at the outcome document of the United Nations General Assembly a special session on drugs in 2016 and the 2019 Ministerial Declaration, those issues are pretty much discussed by member states, not necessarily agreed upon fully, but they are pretty much discussed. And just for me not to take too much time, I will keep floor back to Mirella or directly to Stefano. Thank you.
So thank you, Celso. Now, Stefano, there were 2 or 3 questions more related to INCB. Can you respond to some live? You have 5 more minutes, a bit less.
Yeah, thank you, Mirella, and thank you for the questions. I think there are many. They are coming. It's very difficult to navigate through all of them. I think there was one very specific on how the INCB harmonized the data. That is not too difficult in a sense. We provide countries with forms that are supposed to, in which they're supposed to provide the data on the substances where they need to basically report in grams or kilograms and so on and so forth. So that is something that is working relatively well. I think there was a question, there were a number of questions related to the, I think, cannabis, and I think from Ghana, I saw someone intervening from Ghana. It was not a question directed to INCB, but I can tell that the INCB is basically implementing the decision of the member states in relation to the convention. And one of the requirements of the implementation is to make sure that substances such as cannabis are used for medical and scientific purposes. So we invite countries to report to us the cultivation like we do for other substances, like, for example, opium poppy. And there was a question, I mean, a statement which I don't know, maybe it was directed to Celso, not to me, but Martin Jelsma mentioned, so it is WHO who decides which drugs should be considered to be included in the schedules. I think that we made it clear, at least Celso made it clear, that WHO submits the recommendations. I don't know if I or him misspoke, but then the decision is with the Commission. This is what we have seen happening in various years. So I do not see. I mean, honestly, there are many statements or questions that are put there. I don't see others that may be.
There is one, Stefano, about how INCB members are elected into the committee, maybe.
INCB members are elected in two ways. Maybe I said it, but maybe it was too quick. So there are 10 seats that are reserved to the member states candidates. So when there are the elections, the elections are alternate. There is every 2 years, every year there are 5 members that are elected for the board, and then another 2 years later, another 7 are elected. So they alternate in order to also ensure a level of continuity in the membership. So member states submit the candidature to the ECOSOC, and then the ECOSOC votes in the one that they prefer, the members of the ECOSOC. And then if you go over the threshold, which is 27 or 28 votes, then you are elected. Then there is another election that is reserved only for the members that are submitted by WHO. And again, the member states in ECOSOC consider those candidature that are coming from the Director General of WHO, and generally these are experts in the health field, pharmacology, or addiction, or other pharmacy, etc., forensic science, that are selected by WHO. Again, they are coming, of course, from some countries, but they are identified because of their individual expertise.
I think there was a question, but I think Jamie wanted to say something. I want also to remind everybody that there will be another webinar more on prevention and treatment. So maybe some of the issues could be dealt in the next webinar. But Jamie, please.
Thank you, Mirella. So yeah, it's difficult to follow the questions in the chat because it's moving so quickly, as you say, Stefano. But also I'm looking at the Q&A box, and there's a few questions in there for INCB as well, if I could ask them. So we have Janina Engstrom from Sweden has asked how, I'm just trying to paraphrase, how can INCB respond to the need to be more gender sensitive and for the conventions and the drug response to be more gender sensitive? So that was one question. And the other one was from Catherine Pettus for INCB, asking, saying, despite the excellent work of INCB in conducting workshops and resolutions on access to medicines, the regulatory system is still very challenging for many countries. What other measures can be taken to urge member states to write the imperative of access into their national legislation?
Thank you, Jamie. Also, I think there was another question that I spotted in the chat regarding the statement made by the board on extrajudicial killings in the Philippines. So I think I would invite the person who wrote it to check on our website. There are press releases and statements that have been made also in our annual report about that. So regarding the question on gender, I think the board last year wrote in chapter 1 on the problem of women and drug use that has been identified as an issue that in many ways is not adequately addressed by member states. There are some specific recommendations, in order to make sure that treatment services are open to accepting women without stigmatization, and also that there is a problem with the, if you like, the way in which in many societies the abuse of or the use of drugs by women is particularly stigmatized in comparison to men. So that's something that could be done. The INCB has no specific role or if you like, in terms of implementation of the convention, can only if you like, urge countries and national government to take measures in order to have a better and more equitable approach to the issue of addressing and providing treatment services to all those who need. And as I said, last year there was this, or 2 years ago, there was this chapter 1 on women, and this year it will be about the issue of older person. And regarding the access to controlled substances and what can be done in terms to in order to ensure that there is in the national legislation something that, if you like, would require countries to ensure availability. Again, this is in the convention is an overall objective that is stated in the preamble. There are some specific recommendations on how to, to ensure the, I mean, there are articles that say that this needs to be ensured, but the convention in this area are not prescriptive. What we do is that, what we try to do is when the countries are preparing their estimates, which is their forecast for the next year, we engage with them in order to try to find a method that it would be suitable for their needs and also would reflect the real need that there is in the country, because you cannot have a country of 1 million population asking for, a very, very small amount of morphine, or you are going to have a country of 100 million population again asking for very limited amount. So when this happens, we engage with the countries in order to verify if this is what they really need and make sure that their needs are reflecting their reality. But again, this is not something that is, if you like, specifically or legally mandated in a very strong way by the convention. So it requires a dialogue with the individual governments and trying to convince them of the importance of this.
Thank you, Stefano.
Thank you, Stefano. I think, Celso, do you have anything to add, or we can move to the last presentation?
Thank you, Mirella. No, I think we can go ahead. Thanks.
Thank you, and thank you for answering many of the questions on the chat. I think also Stefano will have the opportunity to do it if in case something hasn't been answered. Now it's my pleasure to pass on to Alicia, who will walk us through this very good tutorial that was developed by the Secretariat of the governing body. It's an e-learning tool that you can use also later at your own path. Alicia, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Yes, so I'll just very quickly introduce the e-learning. So as you already heard from Celso, the Commission on Narcotic Drugs decides on the scope of control of substances. So this, we also call that scheduling, because the substances are added to the schedules of the conventions. And we as Secretariat, we support the Commission in the process. So to ensure that all members of the Commission know about the provisions of the conventions and also of the process of scheduling, we have developed this e-learning tutorial. So it's mainly targeting member states representatives, but it might also be interesting for you if you want to learn more about what Stefano and Celso have touched upon today. So the tutorial is free of charge. Unfortunately, at the moment, it's only available in English. We might develop other language versions at a later stage. You can find it on the website of the Commission, and you can either follow it online or you can also download it if you don't have a stable internet connection. The course is divided in 3 parts, and I would like to show you a short video that gives you a first impression of how the tutorial looks like and also introduces the 3 chapters. So that's the website where you have the 3 parts that you can then click on.
Welcome to Scheduling 101, an introduction to the treaty-based functions of the Commission on Narcotic Drugs. This video has 3 different parts. In part 1, we will provide background information on the work of the Commission on Narcotic Drugs and its normative functions. Part 2 will focus on the scheduling procedure, the processes involved before, during, and after the voting on the scheduling recommendations. In part 3, we will explore the control regimes of the schedules of the 1961 and the 1971 Convention and the tables of the 1988 Convention.
Just to briefly check, Jamie, could you nod if you could hear the sound of the video? Yeah, okay, it works perfect. Thank you very much. Okay, just a second. Now it's playing again. So because I would like to show you now an example of how the substance is explained in the tutorial.
Learn more about the steps leading up to the voting by clicking on the respective boxes. Once you are ready, click on the quiz to test your knowledge or continue to Chapter 2. States parties to the conventions are asked by the Secretariat to submit comments on the scheduling recommendations. These comments are supposed to enable the Commission to take evidence-based decisions. For the 1961 and the 1971 conventions, states parties are asked to provide comments after the medical and scientific assessment by the World Health Organization. Under the 1988 convention, the Secretariat circulates a questionnaire prepared by the International Narcotics Control Board before the final medical and scientific assessment.
So you could see that it goes rather into detail, but you can go through it on your own pace, so you don't have to listen to everything. So we can also skip some things that are maybe less interesting for you. And we also try to keep it rather interactive so that it doesn't get too boring. So we included a few quizzes, and I also would like to show you an example, and maybe after Celso's presentation today, you already know the answers.
Learn more about the steps leading up to the voting by clicking on the respective.
Wrong one. Okay, now here we go.
Before we continue with the next chapter, we invite you to take a short quiz.
So that was just to give you a short idea of what to expect from the tutorial. You have here the link where you can access this. There's no registration necessary. You can just go and have a look. Thank you very much. I would like to pass back to Mirella.
Thank you very much, Alicia. If you have any specific question on this presentation, and either put it in the